everybody, and welcome to our last Charts with Dan for the year. Apologies for my somewhat Spartan setup. I am getting ready to travel to see some friends out in LA, so I'm kind of in between destinations, but that's not what's important. What's important right now is the box office numbers. We're going to look at the Christmas week. We're going to look at this past weekend, which saw two different movies at number one as we wrap out 2024, and let's jump right into it. Let's look first at the 3-day numbers for December 27th through the 29th. This is the Friday through Sunday weekend that we just had, and that saw Sonic the Hedgehog 3, as of right now, barely repeating at number one with $38 million, a 37% drop from its opening weekend last weekend. Its total right now is at about $136.8 million. Right behind is Mufasa the Lion King, which actually has a 5% increase in business from last weekend at $37.1 million. Its domestic total is at $113.4. And these numbers, and we'll look at the 5-day numbers as well in just a couple minutes, are why I said on last week's show that you can't jump to conclusions immediately based off of just the opening weekend numbers for Sonic and Mufasa, because there is so much time during the Christmas week, and there was an interesting kind of a flip-flop between these two movies that we're going to break down. Sonic 3 is doing well. We'll see how it's comparing to the other two. Mufasa the Lion King also, when you looked at last weekend's numbers, some people wrote it off as an absolute disaster. I wouldn't say that. It's certainly not hitting the heights of the previous film, but it had a nice recovery during the Christmas week, and we'll see what it does from here. In third place is Nosferatu, which had a 3-day opening weekend number of $21.1 million, but has opened to $40 million since it came out on Christmas Day, which I think is a great result for that movie. I was really worried that because Robert Eggers is somewhat of a divisive filmmaker, or some might say a niche filmmaker, that he might not be able to draw a big crowd on Christmas week especially, but a lot of people went out to see Nosferatu. That is an absolute win for that movie, and it's a movie that I really like, so I'm personally happy that it's done well. In fourth place was Wicked, which had a 37% increase and a $19.4 million weekend. Moana 2's in fifth. It had a similar increase, 38%, and an $18.2 million weekend, although we are still seeing Wicked in the long run leg out pretty positively against Moana, given the fact that Moana had such a huge opening week and weekend back on Thanksgiving. In sixth place was A Complete Unknown, which opened to $11.6 million. It's made $23.1 million since it opened on Christmas Day. That's a great result for Searchlight. I think one of their best or their best opening ever. So a good start for A Complete Unknown. Baby Girl opens in seventh with $4.3 million over the 3-day weekend, 7.2 over the 5-day weekend. That's an all right result, especially for an A24 film. Gladiator 2 stays in the top 10. It dropped just 9% from the previous weekend for $4.1 million. It's made $163 million. Again, these would be really good numbers if the budget was just a little lower on that movie. Homestead stays in the top 10. It made $3.1 million over the 3-day weekend. And The Fire Inside opens in 10th place at just over $2 million, the latest from Amazon MGM. I don't really know what their theatrical hopes were for that film, but it opens to just around $4.3 million for the 4-day weekend. Let's look at the 5-day, though. So this is Christmas Day through this past Sunday. And when you look at the 5-day numbers, Mufasa the Lion King actually ekes out the win. It made $63.8 million over the 5-day Christmas holiday weekend. Sonic the Hedgehog comes in second place at $59.9 million. As we mentioned, Nosferatu comes in at $40.3 million. Wicked made $31.7 million over the 5-day weekend, followed by Moana 2 at $28.2 million. A Complete Unknown banked $23.1 million, followed by Baby Girl at $7.2 million, Gladiator 2 at $6.9 million, Homestead at $5.4 million, and The Fire Inside at $4.3 million. So Mufasa and Sonic really the only two movies changing positions when you look at the complete 5-day weekend. So let's break down Sonic 3 versus Mufasa and how that flip-flop happened over the Christmas holiday. These are their daily totals, not their cumulative totals, but how much the movies made on each individual day from the day they opened until this past Sunday, so from December 20th to the 29th. And you can see Sonic, which is there in blue, Mufasa in orange. Sonic had the easy advantage, as we talked about last week, on its opening weekend, the 20th, 21st, and 22nd of December. But you can see that those numbers start to get a lot closer as we approach Christmas. The 23rd and 24th are traditionally lower movie-going days, but Mufasa was closing the gap. And then look at the 25th and 26th. Mufasa held the advantage, especially on Christmas Day, outgrossing Sonic 3, which is what allowed it to take that Christmas 5-day victory. But when we get back to this past weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, things go back in Sonic 3's favor, where it starts to narrowly out-earn or basically equal the box office gross of Mufasa. So what does that tell us about these two movies? Well, a couple things. Number one, as I speculated could be the case on last week's show, Sonic 3 was a bit front-loaded. There were more people that rushed out to see it immediately than rushed out to see Mufasa, but it also seems very clear, based on the Christmas Day numbers, that there was some delayed demand for Mufasa, that was the movie that perhaps families planned to go see together on Christmas, which is what contributed to its win on Christmas Day, and a pretty handy win on Christmas Day. So the question with these two movies now is, will these trends continue? Have we seen the peak of demand for Mufasa? Is that big Christmas Day total the most it's going to get, or are families going to continue to go see it? And then with Sonic 3, the fact that we had such a big burst of demand when it first opened, and then again another burst over the weekend, has Sonic basically used up all of his energy? Is there still more pent-up demand for Sonic 3, or is it coming in these concentrated bursts? Is Mufasa going to leg out? These are the things that we don't quite know. We'll see on next week's show as we close out the year and get through the New Year holiday what happened with these two movies. But the Christmas box office frame is very interesting because movies don't behave in the ways that they normally do. So it appears to me that Sonic 3 probably has the overall edge if we're talking final gross, but I'm still not quite sure where the demand lies with these two movies. I think we're going to know a lot more by the time we do the show next week. Also, looking at the Sonic franchise as far as how it stacks up against the previous two films, you can really see the Christmas effect here. The original Sonic movie's in blue there, Sonic 2 is in red, and then Sonic 3 is in black. And you can see that through the first 5 days of release, Sonic 3 was basically where the first movie was and a little bit below where Sonic 2 was up to that point. But starting on day 6, which was the beginning of the 5-day Christmas weekend, you see that big burst from Sonic 3. That is people going to the movies for Christmas, either going to see it for the first time or going to see it again. And as I mentioned before, the question here, now that it's tracking above Sonic and Sonic 2, will be if the demand for Sonic 3 is actually higher than the other two, or if we just saw a concentrated burst of movie going and then we're going to see those numbers drop down to Sonic 2 levels over time. That's stuff that we just don't know yet, but it's interesting to track. Wicked and Moana 2 are also interesting to track. I adjusted this chart a little bit from the way we've been looking at it. This is how they're tracking based on days in release. Now keep in mind that Wicked opened on a Friday versus Moana 2, which opened on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. That's why you see their first 2 days being so close to each other, and then Moana 2 just rocketing off into the stratosphere. That's those Thanksgiving legs kicking in. But you can see that Moana 2 opened up a big lead. Then over time, as it tracks day by day with Wicked, it comes close to matching the gross, then opens up a lead again, then it flip-flops again, then opens up a smaller lead. But you can see that Wicked is now pulling ahead. And those 5 days here, because Wicked has been in release 5 days longer than Moana 2, those 5 days that we see are the 5 Christmas weekend days. So I don't think that the next 5 days of Moana 2's release are going to match what Wicked did over the Christmas weekend. So my guess is over the next week or so, the trend line right now through about 34 days is that Wicked and Moana 2 were roughly even, but I think that Moana 2 is going to fall off of this pace, and unless Wicked really crashes or Moana 2 really surges, I think it is very likely at this point that Wicked will be the higher grossing of the two domestically, although Moana 2 is going to be the much higher grossing film worldwide. Let's talk about Robert Eggers and Nosferatu and just how impressive this performance has been for him as a director. Forget opening weekend grosses. Nosferatu is already the highest grossing film domestically of the 4 that Robert Eggers has directed. It's at $40.3 million. That tops the $34.2 million for The Northman, the $25.1 million for The Witch, and the $10.8 million that The Lighthouse brought in. So that is a big win for Robert Eggers, easily going to be the biggest movie of his career so far. And Nosferatu was also, despite opening on a Wednesday, the 5th highest opener for a horror horror film this year. This is just Friday through Sunday numbers, and all 4 of the other films did open on a Friday, but even though it only had 3 of its 5 total days counted towards the official opening weekend, the Friday through Sunday numbers, Nosferatu was still able to capture number 5 on this list. Dropping out of the box office top 10 this past week, we had The Best Christmas Pageant Ever after 7 weeks and Red One after 6 weeks. It is very ironic that 2 Christmas-themed movies dropped out of the top 10 right around Christmas. Then we have Kraven the Hunter and Lord of the Rings: The War of the Rohirrim out of the top 10 after 2 weeks. No surprise there because those movies were very big disappointments on a box office level. Before we look at the biggest theater count changes for this past weekend, the weekend of the 27th, there were a couple of corrections to last week's show. A lot of these movies report late. For the weekend of December 20th, Red One actually lost half of its theaters, over 1,000 of them, so it was the movie that lost the most theaters going into the Christmas weekend. Werewolves also lost almost all of its theaters. It dropped 929 and was only in 25 of them. Then we had Gladiator 2 dropping 827, The Best Christmas Pageant Ever dropping 658, and The Order dropping the vast majority of its theaters. It never hit wide release. It dropped 501 theaters and was in 102 going into the Christmas week. Now let's look at the biggest theater count changes for the weekend of the 27th. Now, a lot of movies dropped theaters before Christmas, so we don't see those reflected in this chart, and there may be some that are late reporters. We'll update that on next week's show. But Lord of the Rings: The War of the Rohirrim was the top theater dropper. It lost basically over half of its theaters. It lost 1,467 of them and remained in 1,135. Kraven the Hunter had a smaller theater shed than I anticipated. It only lost 774. It was still in 2,437. Gladiator 2 dropped 532 theaters, but it was still in nearly 1,900 theaters overall. The Best Christmas Pageant Ever lost another 364 theaters. It's still in 497. And Moana 2 lost just a small fraction of its theaters, 190 of them. It's still in 3,410. This is what I like to call our road to recovery. The blue line is the box office weekend average from 2015 to 2019. The red line is the average from 2021 to 2023. And the dotted black line is us this year. And you can see that for this last weekend of the year, we pretty much plotted a course directly between where we have been since theaters reopened and where we were before they closed due to the pandemic. Given the box office that we've had so far this year, that's actually not a terrible result. I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with this chart going forward because we are getting further and further away from the theaters closing and reopening from the pandemic. So I'm going to take a look at this data, look at these numbers, and see if it's worth doing for one more year. But overall, when you look at this, it was a year of highs and lows. We underperformed where we have been both pre and post-pandemic several times, but we also overperformed several times. I think it just goes to show you that the box office is more sporadic than it has been, and certainly was before the pandemic. And when we talk about the box office in the year that was, one of the things that I did on last week's show was to ask the people that are members here of the channel what movie that was a flop in 2024 they wish had been a hit. Now, this is not a movie that you wish had been better. It's just a movie that you wish had performed better. And this result was actually more of a runaway than I expected. Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, was the easy winner. 62% of people who responded to the poll said that they wish that Furiosa had been a bigger hit. Transformers 1 came in second at 29%, and then there wasn't a whole lot of voting, I guess not surprisingly, for Joker, Folie à Deux at 6%, and Megalopolis at 4%. And so turning from 2024 to 2025, we have, as always, a few high-profile comic book films. And so the question I asked looking into the next year is, of these 4, which 2025 comic book movie are you most excited about? The options are Captain America: Brave New World, Thunderbolts, Superman, and Fantastic Four: The First Steps. So you can vote on that poll right now if you are a member here on the channel. If you're not a member, there may be a button for you to click if you want to join, depending on how you're watching the video, or you can go down into the description below. There's a link for you to join there as well. And you don't just get to vote in member polls if you're a member, you also get early access to some of my videos, as well as custom badges and emoji. I'd love to have you as a member here on the channel, and I'd love to hear your voice in this poll next week. Let's take a look outside of the United States and Canada at the top grossing movies internationally for the past weekend. Mufasa was at number 1 at $77.1 million, but it was a narrow win over Sonic the Hedgehog 3 at $74 million. There were some people last week that were a little confused when I said that Sonic 3 wasn't yet open in international territories because they'd already seen the movie. That's because there were some paid previews that were held that did not yet count toward the box office total. However, they did count towards the $74 million international weekend total. So a close race really between Sonic 3 in its first international weekend and Mufasa the Lion King in its second international weekend. Moana 2 comes in third at $36.1 million. And then we have a pair of films from China. Big World, about a young man with cerebral palsy, comes in at $29.2 million. And Octopus with Broken Arms, which is the third in the Manslaughter series of Chinese crime thrillers, opened to about $21.5 million. That one, I believe, is set to roll out to other countries in early 2025. When you take those international numbers, you combine them with our domestic totals, we get the top 5 films worldwide, and Mufasa the Lion King leads the pack at $114.2 million. That's just a 6.5 drop-off from its opening international weekend. It's now at $327.9 million worldwide. Sonic the Hedgehog 3, because it opened in so many territories, sees an 80.6% increase in business in weekend number 2 at $112 million. Its worldwide total is now at over $200 million. Moana 2 had an 18.3% increase in business for a $54.3 million weekend. It's now approaching $900 million worldwide. Wicked 2 saw a 26.8% jump in business. It made $33.1 million. Its worldwide total is now $634.3 million. Notably, it is now the highest grossing Broadway adaptation worldwide as well as domestically. It passed Mamma Mia to become the highest grossing Broadway film of all time worldwide, so it now holds that record in all territories. And then Big World comes in at number 5 with its gross solely from China at $29.2 million. Last week, we talked about Mufasa the Lion King and the fact that because the first Lion King film earned so much that it stands in a position to have one of the biggest drop-offs for a $1 billion+ grossing film and its sequel by percentage of all time. And I laid out some milestones or metrics that it needs to hit. It has already exceeded the gross that it needed to make to not be the first or second biggest drop by percentage from a $1 billion+ movie to its sequel. No surprise there. I don't think anyone expected it to match the Marvels or Joker Folie à Deux in that regard. It needs to make $448.7 million worldwide in order to beat Alice Through the Looking Glass and not be the third biggest drop off by percentage. I think that we're heading in that direction. We'll see what it does in the next few weeks to see if it can get to that $636.5 million gross in order to avoid fourth place, which is currently held by Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. All right, moving back now to the domestic marketplace, let's look at some of what I like to call the specialty charts. And before we look at this weekend's per theater averages, there were some small corrections to last weekend's per theater averages. The number one film was the same, which was The Brutalist, which had one of the best 2024 per theater averages of the year at $66,698 in 4 theaters. A movie that had not reported last week when I did the show actually came in second. It's called Los Frikis, and it made $19,169 per theater in 2 theaters. This film is from the writer-directors of The Peanut Butter Falcon, and it's about a punk band in early 90s Cuba who seek to build their own way of life on a government sanatorium. The movie is based on true events. The Room Next Door came in third at $17,502 per theater, followed by Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Nickel Boys. Now let's look at the per theater averages for this weekend, and it's still the same movie at the top, The Brutalist, which expanded to 7 theaters and brought in $29,000 per theater. As of right now, Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is in second place at just over $10,000 per theater, with Mufasa in third at $9,000 per theater. The Room Next Door is in fourth at $8,471 per theater in 6 theaters. And then Vermiglio comes in fifth at $8,450, playing in just 1 theaters. Vermiglio is an Italian film that won second place at the Venice Film Festival. It follows a deserter in World War II Italy who arrives in a small village and falls in love with a local woman, and it's currently on the short list for consideration at the Academy Awards for Best International Feature. So it's one of the, I believe, 15 films that is eligible to be nominated. We'll see if Italy can land a nomination this year. Looking at the top films in limited release, again, we're going to go back to last week, the 20th through the 22nd, because there was one minor correction. The top 4, I believe, remain the same, with Queer, The Brutalist, Flow, and The Room Next Door in the top 4 slots, but the order actually took the 5th slot in 103 theaters, bringing in $64,000, so I wanted to update that one. Looking at the top films in limited release as of right now for this past weekend, at number 1 was a film from India called Baby John. It's a Hindi language action film about a cop who goes undercover to protect his family. It brought in $237,000 in 325 theaters. Then we have The Brutalist in second place, bringing in just over $200,000 in 7 theaters. Flow in 109 theaters brings in almost $200,000 in its 6th week. In 4th place, we have All We Imagine Is Light in 31 41 theaters, bringing in just over $50,000. And in fifth place, The Room Next Door, right at the $50,000 mark in 6 theaters. I will, of course, update this chart on next week's show if there are additional movies that are reported today. Looking at the 2024 fall holiday box office, so this is all releases from Labor Day to the end of the year. Wicked remains number one at $424.2 million, assuming that it doesn't fall off of its pace. It looks like it will be the number one movie of the fall holiday box office season. Moana 2 is in second, followed by Beetlejuice, Gladiator 2, and The Wild Robot. Venom: The Last Dance is in sixth place for now, but Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is right behind at number 7. Mufasa: The Lion King enters the list at number 8. Red 1 drops down 2 spots to number 9, and Smile 2 drops to number 10. Transformers 1 is now out of the top 10 for the fall holiday box office season. And looking at the 2024 domestic box office overall, the top 3 I think are going to be the same. Inside Out 2 is locked there, as is Deadpool and Wolverine at number 2. Wicked is at number 3. Moana moves up 1 spot to number 4. It has passed the gross of Despicable Me 4, which drops down to number 5. And then the bottom 6 remain the same, with Beetlejuice, Dune Part 2, Twisters, Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, and Kung Fu Panda 4 at $193.5 million. If neither Sonic nor Mufasa can pass that $193.5 million barrier, then this very well may be the final top 10 at the 2024 domestic box office. We'll just have to see how those films do over the next week or so. Looking at the 2024 worldwide box office, Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine are at numbers 1 and 2, the $2 billion grossing films of the year. We'll see if Moana has another $120 million or so left in the tank at the worldwide box office. Despicable Me 4 is at number 3 right now at $969.1 million. Moana 2 is at number 4. Dune Part 2 is in 5th place. Wicked moves up to number 6 with $634.3 million, which bumps Godzilla Kong: The New Empire down to number 7. We will see if there are any other movies that will enter the top 10 here. I think it's very likely that there will be. Before we look at the streaming charts, I want to do, as I often do here on the show, a look back at a weekend in box office history. And we're going to go back to the last weekend of the year, back in 1997. This was the second week of Titanic's release, and it saw a 23.8% increase in business for the 3 days following Christmas, which is a peak movie-going time. It made $35.4 million in its second weekend. Adjusted for inflation, that would be $69.6 million. Tomorrow Never Dies dropped 18.5% in its second weekend. It very nearly beat Titanic for number 1 the weekend that they both debuted. It made $20.4 million, which adjusted for inflation would be $40.2 million. As Good as It Gets opened in third place at $12.6 million, followed by Mouse Hunt, which saw a big jump in its second weekend, a 60% increase in business, not that surprising for a family film. It made $9.7 million, which would be $19 million adjusted for inflation. And then in the fifth slot was what I think is Quentin Tarantino's most underrated film, Jackie Brown, which opened to $9.2 million. Adjusted for inflation, that would be $18.2 million. Jackie Brown is seen by many at the time as a disappointment, but I think the time has been pretty kind to that movie as far as overall reception. Of course, Titanic would go on to become the highest grossing film of all time, both domestically and worldwide. And so our box office flashback question this week is, what movie did Titanic dethrone to become the highest grossing domestic film of all time when it broke that record in 1998? Now, some people might think that this is an easy question, but you have to stop and think about it just a little bit. So I'll give you a couple more seconds, but here comes the answer. The movie that Titanic dethroned to become number 1 of all time domestically was Star Wars. And a lot of people say, no, wait a minute, it wasn't Star Wars, it was Jurassic Park. But you have to remember that early in 1997, they released the Star Wars Special Edition, which did very well in theaters. It did so well, in fact, that Star Wars came back and reclaimed the number 1 movie of all time distinction from Jurassic Park until Titanic came back about a year later and took that record away. So that was one that, when I'm thinking about questions, that question popped in my head. I'm like, well, that's too easy. It's Jurassic Park. But I had forgotten that Star Wars had actually come back and taken that number 1 spot. And that is who Titanic was able to dethrone. Let's turn now to the most viewed programs on streaming. These are the top 10 programs on Netflix for the week of December 16th through the 22nd. So going into the Christmas holiday, new numbers should be released tomorrow. And Carry On, which had a great debut, had an even better second weekend with 110.2 million hours watched and 55.1 million views, which is one of the best numbers we've seen this year, and I'll break that down in just a couple minutes. The question that I had last week was, is Carry On one of those Netflix films that sees a big surge at first and then drops off? Or is it one of those movies that has a nice opening and then word of mouth, etc. kicks in and you see a big jump in week number 2? Well, there was a jump in week number 2. And based off of what Netflix was telling me all through Christmas week, I think we should see another big number when the new numbers come out tomorrow. So Carry On, a big hit for Netflix. In second place was La Palma, the Netflix original series, which came in at 24.69 million views. The 6888 from Tyler Perry opens in third. It brought in 14.27 million views, followed by The Grinch in fourth place at 11.37 million views. That Christmas in fifth at 11.13 million views. Virgin River debuts on the chart with its sixth season at 8.14 million views, followed by Disaster Holiday in seventh place at 7.48 million views. Disaster Holiday is a film from South Africa about a dad who books the wrong vacation with what I assume are hilarious results. Our Little Secret stays in the top 10 at number 8, followed by Black Dove Season 1, and then at number 10, Fairy 2, which is a film from the Netherlands about a retired drug lord. Naturally, it is the sequel to the 2021 film Fairy. And let's break down just how good that number was for Carry On. It was actually the top performance for any movie this year as far as number of views with 55.1 million. That's better than the second week of Damsel, which had held the record from back in March at 50.85 million views. Carry On also has the third best performance for any movie this year on Netflix for its first week, which brought in 42 million views. Beverly Hills Cop Axel F is in fourth place with its first week of release at 41.05 million views, and Under Paris is in fifth place in its first week at 40.9 million views. And Carry On wasn't just the best number for any movie this year on Netflix, it was the best number for any program on Netflix in 2024. Its 55.1 million views makes it the most views that any program has gotten in any week this year, again displacing Damsel, which wasn't number 1. The Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson fight is in third place at 46.64 million views. Bridgerton Season 3 is in fourth at 45.05 million views, and then Carry On is the number 5 number there at 42 million views. We'll see if it can add to that number when those new numbers are released tomorrow. Looking at the most watched movies on Netflix in 2024, Carry On enters the chart at number 7 at 97.1 million views, but look at the upward mobility because it's only about 2 million views away from hitting the number 5 spot, and then after that, it would be only about 7 million views away from hitting the number 2 spot. If it puts up a decent number, we could easily see it at number 2, and I think that Damsel is in serious danger of being displaced as the most watched movie of 2024 on Netflix because with jumps like these, it's not going to take Carry On that long to get there. A Family Affair moves down to number 8, Beverly Hills Cop Axel F moves down to number 9, and Our Little Secret enters the chart with 73.26 million views, so a win there for Lindsay Lohan. Atlas and Mother of the Bride, which have been on this chart for a very long time, are now out of the most watched movies of 2024. And looking at the most watched programs on Netflix in 2024, Carry On is now at number 9 at 97.1 million views. That bumps Baby Reindeer down to number 10 and A Family Affair off of the overall top 10. And as with the movie chart, Carry On has a lot of very easy upward mobility. Again, could be at number 2 by next week. And this just goes to show you how unpredictable the streaming business can be, because with movies from Eddie Murphy and the second Zack Snyder Rebel Moon movie, all of the high-profile projects that Netflix has had, it looks like their biggest movie and maybe even their biggest show or movie of the year is an action drama starring Taron Egerton about a TSA guy in an airport. You just never really know what's going to connect on streaming, and I think that's what makes it so interesting to watch and track. I actually don't have any Nielsen ratings for you this week because apparently they took the holiday week off. You know what? I can't blame them. So we'll probably double up on Nielsen ratings on next week's show. And that actually brings us to a close as far as Charts with Dan for this week and this year. Traditionally on New Year's weekend, the studios don't really release anything, and it's no different this year. So there's not a whole lot coming out this week, just a couple things on streaming for you to check out. On Netflix, they're releasing 2 different documentaries tomorrow on New Year's Eve, Avicii, My Last Show, and Avicii, I'm Tim. Both of these follow Tim Bergling, aka Avicii, the prolific DJ and producer who sadly died by suicide in 2018. My Last Show is a recording of his final public performance in Ibiza, and I'm Tim is a feature documentary about his life in his own words. Also on Friday, January 3rd, premiering on Netflix is Wallace and Gromit: Vengeance Most Foul, the first feature-length Wallace and Gromit adventure in quite some time. I have seen this movie. I think that it is really, really good. So if you're looking for some good family entertainment or actually just a really good comedy to start off 2025, I think that that's a really solid choice. And that wraps it up for Charts with Dan this week and this year. Thank you to everybody that has watched the show and tracked the box office through a very interesting 2024. 2025 is packed, and you will actually find here on the channel on New Year's Day a preview of what's to come in 2025. Tomorrow, I will have my annual list of my favorite and least favorite movies of the year. And then next week, we'll break down all of the 2024 numbers, how we stacked up as far as total box office versus 2023, what the market share is, all of the stuff that we usually do to wrap out the year. Thank you so much for watching the channel and for watching the show. Be sure to stay tuned right here for more movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.